Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to your cybersecurity series. My name is Vlad and I'm here to support you engage in cybersecurity, even if perhaps you don't have a technical background. Today, this is episode 23 and we will continue our journey on cryptography. If you've watched the previous episodes on the Caesar and Vigenère ciphers, or even the skytales that were used by the Spartans, perhaps you are under the impression that cryptography is all about mixing letters or switching characters. But that would only be a limited understanding of cryptography. The truth is that cryptography throughout history has been for a very long time associated with military science. It was really taken over by military personnel and researchers in order to develop new techniques to protect the confidentiality of communications. And it's not only about letters as we have seen, but there are also other techniques. And today I would like to highlight book ciphers. I'm taking a precise example. Maybe you have already recognized that's a scene coming from Sherlock Holmes movie, A Game of Shadows. That's the title, and we will start with this example because it does feature an excellent example, I think, of book ciphers. So what it's all about, basically, as in any Sherlock movie or any Sherlock adaptation, I'm sure you know about it. It features our famous detective and investigator Sherlock Holmes here on the left, played by Robert Downey Jr., facing his nemesis, and his nemesis is none other than Professor James Moriarty, who, in the story, leads a vast network of criminals. He is the head of this entire criminal empire and is more of an intermediary, like people who connects criminals together, funds some of their activities, ships weapons, drugs, coordinates assassination attempts, and so on and so forth. And really, at some point in the movie, there is this specific scene where they are playing chess together, but not chess as in on a traditional solid board with chess pieces. They are playing blind chess, meaning that they are shouting moves at each other and they have to remember all of the moves, all of the pieces' positions. And of course, in such a duel, which is completely in the mind, let's say, to get the upper hand, Sherlock Holmes is trying to destabilize his opponent, Moriarty. And the thing is that he is leading him to believe that he has identified critical information about his criminal network. Because throughout the movie, we have seen Moriarty interacting with a certain journal or a small book, and we don't really know what's really inside. But the assumption made by Sherlock at the time is that all of the darkest secrets of Moriarty are recorded. So perhaps a client list or a list of point of contact in the criminal organizations, maybe some information about the different shipments, all perhaps of the finances of Moriarty would be recorded in that book that he always carries with him. And it's later revealed that this book is actually a very common book that can be found in libraries or bookshops, and is called The Art of Domestic Horticulture. So, how could such a blank or average book be really the place where Moriarty stores all of his genius criminal enterprises? And that's revealed, of course, later. Sorry for the spoilers. But basically, at some point in the movie, they understand because Sherlock Holmes manages to get a hand on the book. And when going through the pages, he highlights certain patterns. So here, that's one of the examples. So on the right, you might recognize the famous Fibonacci sequence, starting with 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, etc., etc. The idea is that every number is the sum of the two previous numbers. So number 5 is the sum of 3 and 2, 2 is the sum of 1 and 1, etc., etc. And on the left side of the screenshot, you can also recognize a pyramid of numbers. And this pyramid is also quite famous in mathematics because it follows the same principle as Fibonacci. The idea is that if you look at the bottom row, for example, 84, 84 is actually the sum of the two numbers that are above in the pyramid. So 84 is the sum of 28 and 56. 56 is the sum of 21 and 35, etc., etc., as you climb upwards in the pyramid. And you might be wondering what's the point of all of those numbers, but actually, and it's revealed right after in the movie, it's not really about the numbers themselves, but more about the positions of those numbers. And altogether, when you apply the principle of the pyramid, you can actually pinpoint certain characters within a page of the book. And that's really the method that is being used by Moriarty in the movie to, let's say, conceal certain informations. And of course, he is sending those messages to his associates who have the similar book and can decode some of the messages. So here we are really in a context that is a bit in between cryptography and steganography. You can check out my previous video on that if you are unaware of steganography. It's a marvelous discipline that has, let's say, touch points with cryptography. But the idea is the following: really hiding some patterns, some words, some characters in a book using a book cipher. Of course, later in the movie, the police, so the Metropolitan Police of London, managed to decode everything with the help of Irene Adler, which is a friend of Sherlock Holmes, and they are eventually bankrupting Moriarty. No spoilers there. I mean, the villain always loses in the Sherlock Holmes movies, so I'm sure you won't be surprised. But coming back to those book ciphers, this idea is not new, and it was really a prolific way of encrypting communications, even in the 1800s until the 1900s, until basically the modern computers were invented, so around the 1950s approximately. But it was widely used by the military and by many others. Here I'm giving you three examples, so those are French examples of dictionaries, here telegraphic dictionaries that were being used to encrypt certain communications. If we take a closer look at one of them, I can easily explain that. Basically, those books, one of them was made of 100 pages, and all the pages are numbered. Here in the screenshot, you have page 23 and page 24. On each of the pages, you would get 100 expressions or 100 words that you can play with. So, for example, you can look at here on page 23, it starts on the left with 00, faire courir le bruit, which means basically setting a rumor or saying a rumor in general. I know it's in French, but no worries, I will translate all of that if you are not a French speaker. So how do you use it? In practice, what you would send as an encrypted message would be what I have written at the bottom, 2422, 2392, 2444, 2454. And every time that corresponds to a number of a page and a number of words. So for example, here, 2422 actually corresponds to the word capture that we have here on the right of the screenshot. And then 2392 corresponds to the word on page 23, and we take word 92, which says candidate of the opposition, so opposing candidate, in the context of a general election, for example. 2444 means en cas de, in case of, and finally 2454 would refer to catastrophe. So here the message coded with just 4 sets of numbers would be capture the candidate of opposition in case of disaster or catastrophe. Of course, that doesn't mean anything without a further context, but that's how you would use such a book. And you can also see that on the left part, on page 23, there are some handwritten notes. And that's really the idea. This book was not meant to be exhaustive. At certain areas in the book, there would be blank spaces so that you and your friends or the people you want to communicate with would write certain terms that are specific to your context. So you could also amend or reuse this notion to convey messages. So in terms of pros and cons, and this method is really, you have to understand that it's almost impossible to break without having the dictionary. So same as the example in the Sherlock Holmes movie, if you don't have the book on the horticulture, and by the book I mean the exact same version, the exact same edition of the book, there is almost no way you would break the message. At least you could do it even without the book, but that would require extreme collection of or interception of many messages, and you would have to have a main on the inside to perhaps identify that in my example here, maybe the word 2454 comes back very often, and at some point with context you will understand that it refers to a disaster or a catastrophe, but you would have to reverse engineer the entire book, and that's almost impossible without modern computing techniques. So pros, almost impossible to break. Then in terms of cons, well, the first thing is you need to share the book with your associates. And immediately after that, yes, there are some high chances of interceptions, and that's something that is hardly scalable. If your criminal organizations like Moriarty is composed of thousands of members or hundreds of members, you can really understand that it's not really practical. In some other movies, or sometimes even in the medieval context, they are using the Bible because the Bible was at the time always edited on the same version, so and easily found, let's say, in hotel rooms. Even nowadays, in many hotel rooms, for example, in the United States, you would have an edition of the Bible. So you could invent a similar technique by giving coordinates to certain pages or certain verses from the Bible. But that's again another example of book cipher, which relies on the fact that everybody has the same version of the book or the same printing layouts. There is a way to get rid of all of those cons, even, for example, the chances of interceptions, and it doesn't matter as long as you're able to share the book. The idea would be to use increments, and that's something that we have seen in the previous episode on the Vigenère ciphers. I showed you that we are using in the Vigenère cipher a specific word, and we are sliding this keyword, which is our encryption key, we are sliding it throughout the message in order to encrypt all of the letters. The idea is that we can increment our key, so to speak. So here, in the context of book ciphers, let's say that the message we want to share is capture the candidate of the opposition in case of disaster. So the previous message in red is what we would have sent traditionally, but perhaps what we can do on top of that is agree with a subset of colleagues or peers or conspirators. With a subset of them, we can agree that we will use the book, we will use the coordinates. However, every time that we send each other messages, we will increase the number corresponding to the page number by 2 and the word by 10. So instead of sending 2422, we will send to each other 2632. And same, so instead of 2392, we will send 25102. And of course, as co-conspirators, the guys know that they would have to subtract 2 and subtract 10 in order to recompose the original message. And you can really imagine that even if you are in a situation with the proper book, without computing techniques, trying all the possible combinations is not going to fit. Here, you could already guess that something is wrong with the message because in my example, I have 25, 102, and we know by default that they are only 100 words, so it goes until 99. It starts as 00, but it ends at 99 on the page. So we know that something is a bit fishy, and probably the identifiers for the word have been increased. But by how many? That's completely impossible or almost impossible to guess. It would require extensive researches and variations, combinations throughout the book. So you can really apply different cryptographic technique, and that's my message today. You can take one basic mean, which is the book cipher, and on top of that, you can apply some traditional cryptographic methods like increments, same as the Vigenère ciphers and applying increments on top of the key. If that's not familiar to you, I really encourage you to have a look back at the previous episode. Anyway, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed this example of book ciphers. It's a bit lighter, it's a different mechanisms and could be used by anyone without headaches or without extensive mathematics notions. Next episode will also come this week. I'm recording it as we speak, so I hope you enjoyed. Don't hesitate to leave a comment or share. I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you and see you soon.